Hello, everybody, and welcome today for joining us for COVID Conversations. And this is an initiative of Ready for Black Lives. As you know, here we always begin with our land acknowledgement and our moment of silence, and then we'll move into the program. So I'd like to begin, and I'd like to ask you, if wherever you are, if you're able to sit comfortably or stand comfortably as you're able. And if you can, actually close your eyes. It helps you center and be present. We'd like to start by acknowledging the land on which we are gathered today and by acknowledging the caretakers of this land. This is the land of the treaty territory of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation and the ancestral and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, Chippewa, Huron-Wendat nations. Listening and reciting land acknowledgements is an important action. However, ending settler colonialism, its discriminatory institutions, vehicles of knowledge production, and the white supremacy that it thrives on is equally as important. I ask you, what are you doing to end the occupation? This moment demands that you do more than acknowledge Canada's settler colonial history and present and own your own position on this land. And so in light of that, I'd like to take a moment of silence, as we do here at COVID Conversations, in recognition of the civil unrest, not just in Canada or the US, or around the world, but to recognize that as humans, we're struggling to live together on this planet and to respect each other, and to recognize that Black lives so often that build the capital system that we have are often forgotten. And so in recognition of those lives that have died at the hands of the state and other forms of violence and who have passed on as a result of COVID, and to our essential workers out there, we thank you, and in memory of you, we take this moment of silence. I'd like to now introduce Joanna. Joanna is an Anishinaabe, an Ojibwe woman from Serpent River First Nation, and she is a registered social worker. She works through an intersectional and trauma-informed lens and integrates her Anishinaabe teachings into her role as a helper in the Indigenous community. In carrying the Anishinaabe original instructions Joanna's mother taught her are the ceremonies of purification, the sweat lodge, fasting, and the pipe. Joanna has her bachelor's in social work, and she is currently completing her master's of social work in the Indigenous Trauma and Resiliency program at the University of Toronto. Joanna has 20 years of social work experience working in Toronto's Indigenous community with the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in the areas of community and family development.
Thank you, Lana, for that introduction. Bonjour, ni nabwid gijit kwe nadishnakas, mishkan todem, chikanabek siming doljaba. I just introduced myself in my language, Anishinaabe. My name is Standing Cedar, and I come from the Turtle Clan, and I live in Serpent River First Nation. It's an honor to be invited to do this opening for Ready for Black Lives. I am lighting some sage here to start us off in a good way. And so with sage, we like to do an opening, our circles, our gatherings, our meetings, any type of event, just to help prepare ourselves to open our hearts and open our minds. So I have this sage burning here, and I'm sending this all to you. And so if you could just take a moment, maybe close your eyes and inhale, and hopefully you can smell that sage wherever you are joining us from. And so with this opening, I'd like to begin by acknowledging Creator. And Creator, we ask that you join and you watch over this group of Ready for Black Lives, the organizers and the participants. We ask that you help us open our minds and our hearts, and that you connect them, and so that we can process this knowledge that is being shared with us, but we're able to transfer that knowledge, into action. And so I acknowledge the four directions. The four directions where the grandfathers and the grandmothers sit. I ask that you come and join us And when I call on the grandfathers and the grandmothers of the four directions, I'm calling in those ancestors to each of us, to that indigenous land where, we all come from. And so if you come from Africa, or if you come, from Europe or Turtle Island here in Canada, United States, calling on for actions, so the Black, white, people of color. And so we ask the ancestors, our helpers and guides, to walk with us, as we journey in humility, in the work that we do that will support each and every one of us and the ones who were vulnerable and who need it the most. And so with this opening, we give thanks to all that guidance that we will be receiving. And we give thanks to that tobacco that Lana James had offered to this event, that had offered to the creator, to the grandfathers and grandmothers, to help us do things in a good way, and to recognize that we are all helpers and we all have our own gifts, and that when we come together, we are able to create change. And so I say, Chimigwech, 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 Chimigwech. Thank you. And so I want to thank you all for having me share some of those words with you all today. And I hope you feel that sage medicine that I had shared with you all. And I hope you are enjoying the view from my home, Serpent River First Nation.
Hi, thank you, Joanna. Hello, everyone. And so we're here today for healthcare data and informed consent in the 21st century, what 10 companies have planned for patient information and what you need to know. That's our session today. And we will be moving forward with Jack Polson. So Jack Polson will provide a window into the workings of the big six tech companies. Earlier this month, he released a report. It's called Reports of a Silicon Valley Military Divide Have Been Greatly Exaggerated. The findings of that report have implications for patient data. In a recent interview in The Guardian, Polson discussed the need for tech workers to understand what they are engaging in, saying, I believe tech workers need informed consent about when and what their work may lead to loss of life or suppression of human rights or freedoms. Today, we are also going to talk a bit about what that might mean for health tech workers and researchers. And do they have the right to exercise those options? And we will also consider how health system obligations inform patients and what their obligations for informing those patients about what sharing their healthcare data may mean in a world where data constantly converges. Jack Polson and I will think through what it means to collect and hold healthcare data in the 21st century. Jack, I'm going to introduce you now. Jack Polson received his PhD in applied mathematics in 2012 before working as an assistant professor of mathematics at Stanford, and he was also a senior science research scientist at Google. He is now an independent computational scientist with a focus on open source mathematics software and an advocate for scientists negotiating ethical boundaries of their work. Jack, would you like to join us?
All the work organizing this, and also a huge thank you to Joanna for that, for sharing that introduction with us.
And so Jack's going to talk to us a little bit about his work. In particular, he's done an amazing report recently. And some of the things that we often don't think about here in Canada have to do with what is the military-industrial complex doing? In Canada, we're often known as a friendly country, as many Canadians know. We're known about our peace missions, but not so much known about the work that we do with other countries in relation to the military. And the US being one of our strongest trade relationships and our closest physically, with the Pentagon just hours away, we have relationships, whether we know it or not, to the United States in this vein. And so often we think about things in very separate and distinct packages as if they don't converge. And so today, Jack's going to talk to us a bit about his report, the relationships between military, human rights, what it means to turn a profit and be in business, and how these things converge, and how we as Ontarians and Canadians need to really think about what it means to be sharing our data with systems when it can flow in directions and in places we never imagined. Jack?
Thank you. Kind of themes that have been mentioned so far, and to some degree, the focus on healthcare is not at all making contact with the report. But if one digs a bit deeper into one of the themes as to how it is that Silicon Valley has been differentiating itself in order to make it further inroads within the Department of Defense, the roots of that are leveraging its expertise in artificial intelligence, as well as cloud computing, and at an even more fundamental level in productively building software systems. And so a big part of this, the reason that I wrote this report in the first place, ties into what you were mentioning about conscientious objecting as a tech worker. And so one of the things that has been a major theme over the last couple of years is that tech workers, especially in Silicon Valley, have said, hey, look, if you're asking us to build systems which are going to be used for, let's say, drone surveillance that might lead to further drone strikes, then we have a right to know what we're working on, and we have a right to have a voice in whether or not our company is profiting from something like the business of war. And so again, like, cloud computing has been one of the major themes. And so it turns out that cloud computing is also how these companies are differentiating themselves to enter into the healthcare market. And so far before COVID, Google, Amazon, Microsoft have been heavily investing into entering into healthcare. Arguably, Amazon has done the most on that front. But to another degree, healthcare is seen, beyond being a large market, is a way to reorient the conversation and to kind of push back against the tech lash that has happened, which says that these companies are engaging in surveillance capitalism, that they're sort of predatory, and to flip that on its head and instead say, actually, it's unethical to not let us collect this data, because if we get to use AI for healthcare, then we actually save many more lives than we would have otherwise. And so I think they really like that to be the way they're seen. And so you can kind of view that their expansions into weapons and into healthcare is kind of two different branches with the same core technology differentiator.
And so I wanted to touch on that a little bit more. So just to kind of relate it, for example, to Ontario. In Ontario, we have something called the Public Health Ontario, and it's an agency, and it's responsible for processing and interpreting epidemiologic data for the province and sharing that. Interestingly, in the last few weeks alone, they've taken up a contract with Salesforce. I was quite surprised when I saw Salesforce in the mix. And what's interesting, folks, you don't need to know a lot, but the name is Salesforce. It's actually software that was designed for selling. And now this is the same software that the system will be using to move your personal health information through, among other things. I also found Salesforce in your report. So in the area where it talked about relationships between tech companies or data-driven companies and military companies, we see that in Wahensi's report that Salesforce is part of the larger work of dispossession of people in the US through different deportation and surveillance systems. And so, I then looked a little bit further and I found online that Salesforce has a number of human rights concerning issues. And I'm not sure if you've seen any of this, but there are a number of organizers and advocates for human rights, questioning Salesforce's engagement in a number of areas. And so this tech piece and this military piece brings us into areas where we want to see stronger ethics. And one of the questions I wonder about as you did this work, given your own, ethical considerations, is it right to be having companies that have human rights violations that are playing at the edge of the law, holding such large contracts uncontested, unqueried? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, given the ways in which the military piece kind of moves fluidly along with tech companies as they expand their business into civilian and military contexts.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on a theme that has shown up a number of times, which is, for example, when Palantir has done work with the U.S. Census, it also has been working with immigrations and customs enforcement, in particular their Homeland Security Investigations Division. And they've also been working with Health and Human Services on COVID. And so there was a letter that was written soon after that contract was announced by a few U.S. senators to Health and Human Services that essentially called into question a company like Palantir simultaneously handling sensitive health records and working with an organization that's responsible for deportations. There are numerous other examples of this. You talked about Salesforce. They have more than $20 million in contracts with immigrations and customs enforcement as well. With the Department of Homeland Security. I think it might be through Customs and Border Protection, not ICE. But the general concern is that these companies might in some way be combining these data sets, or perhaps some of the data might leak over from sort of protection into targeting. And there's an entire conversation that can be had there. It's a lot broader than healthcare. It's something I care a lot about, and many people for some time have been calling for organizations like FEMA in the U.S., which is responsible for emergency management, that it should be removed from the Department of Homeland Security, to detach it from some of the more military and law enforcement components. And so that conversation of, is there any separation really between protection and targeting when it comes to government data collection, I think is an important conversation.
And I just wanted to make some connections, because we work in different spheres, but our work becomes very compatible when we talk about these bleed throughs or these leakages. And when we talk about this idea of sensitive information being in the hands of corporations who hold contracts and who are functioning in countries and in jurisdictions where we actually have no control over whether or not they're mixing data sets, because we don't have the legal and regulatory frameworks in place currently that, one, make that demand in the Canadian context, and two, have any meaningful oversight or penalty for not meeting that demand if in fact it was in place. And so one of the things that really shook me when I read your report was, these are some big players. I mean, these people drop they produce the backbone to like obliterate whole cities. And that's one thing we don't usually think about. But the fact that they hold so many keys to so many kingdoms, I think, is the more concerning thing. And this idea of pooling and moving data and not having clear pathways between what stays in one place doesn't move into another place. So that if Amazon is in fact, for example, holding a contract for any aspect of, in this instance, Canadian healthcare, that we as Canadians can be confident that that data does not mix or get involved with their work in the military and or providing other third parties with that kind of training data sets or the like.
Yeah, so another example of this is that maybe is a little bit more relevant to the case of Canada, because sort of before this, we talked a little bit about the theme that if one just talks about what goes on in the US, if you're in Canada, you may think, oh, well, that doesn't apply to me. Well, an important case to look at is, well, how do US tech companies behave in, say, England? Because that behavior will be reasonably similar to what you might expect from their behavior in Canada. And so the same theme, again, that you're talking about is played out with a pretty public case of freedom of information requests for contracts between Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Palantir, and a British artificial intelligence firm tied to the UK government called Faculty. In many of these cases, they only charged $1 to build systems to help the UK's National Health Service set up essentially a dashboard to monitor COVID. And what's interesting about this is these are for-profit companies. So if they're only charging that small amount of money, it's difficult to argue that the insights and that they're gaining from access to that data aren't the primary motivation beyond marketing. I mean, you have to combine those two things. And perhaps to argue in good faith, these sorts of contracts set them up sort of in a lobbying sense for future much more lucrative contracts. But the fact is that data access and just sort of learning how to build models around these data sets is a big deal.
And we have just coming across the screen from one of the attendees and participants today, just pointing out some history around Lockheed Martin's work already in Canada. And I noticed that Lockheed also showed up in your report. And so for me, as someone who, has kind of kept track of what's been going on to a degree, I was concerned because this piece that we're talking around, why would a for-profit company pay $1 to a government to access its data, and why, more importantly, would a government allow that, given that data is the economy? And we keep talking about what is the value of data, how data produces business for this, quote, new economy, or rather newer economy. And so when I hear something like that happening in the UK, it makes me wonder, well, given how little we've seen done on privacy in Canada around data, might that be happening right under our nose, and we might not even know about it until it's reported? Interestingly, folks, in looking at the privacy legislation in Ontario and Canada, it seems to be that if our investigative reporters don't get out there and sniff out the case, our privacy commissioner at the federal and provincial level has been largely silent. And so when I read your report, I thought to myself, has the federal or provincial privacy commissioner written this report and made any parallels? And so I wanted to kind of circle back a little bit here to you, Jack, and ask you a little bit about the human rights aspect, because I'm thinking about your departure from Google and the fact that you did draw a line in the sand. And I know there's people listening right now who can be in innovation projects right here in Toronto, across Canada, are sitting in labs, are coding for things, are approving for things that they may have a sinking feeling about. Can you talk to those folks a little bit about how you went from where you were to where you are now, being the ED of techinquiry.org?
Sure. Hopefully it's all right if I make contact a bit with the comment that was submitted from one of the listeners about Lockheed Martin's StatCan contract. So that's actually not at all surprising from a historic perspective. In fact, essentially all of the major defense contractors, I mean, money is money, right? Like if you're a company and there's a lucrative contract with the government, you're going to take it. You're not going to say, well, in many cases, they don't restrict themselves just to weapons development. And so there's numerous sorts of engagements that one would find very surprising. One that I ran into through digging through contracts was even like a student loan website being developed by one of the weapons contractors. I forget if it was Leidos or SAIC, but it was one of the very big ones. But healthcare has always been a big part, if nothing else, for the reason that the Department of Defense has a lot of people, and you need to take care of those people. And so healthcare, even within the Department of Defense, is a big deal. So these sorts of contractors do a lot of IT for healthcare. And one can imagine there's a sensitive component to the healthcare records of military. And so from that perspective, it's not new for these companies to engage in these other sectors. It just might be uncomfortable as someone who is, again, asking this question, like, am I being protected or am I being targeted when it comes to something like deportations? That's a relevant question, even if it's not a new or surprising confluence of behavior. But to your question on as a tech worker, I guess I'd be curious if there's a particular part of that you'd want to drill in on, given that I kind of waxed poetic a bit on the user question.
Yeah, I'm thinking about folks who came to the session today thinking there's something really strange afoot that I'm developing, and I'm not quite sure it's exactly what I thought it was. How did you identify the moment when you thought you needed to ask more than the question and actually start to think about, because in the article it says that you tried vehemently over a 30-day period to try to figure out what the company was going to do, and it wasn't a very positive set of actions, and so you made your decision. For folks out there who might have to go through the same thing, given the proliferation of work that COVID has generated, and many people have actually talked to me and talked about the times in which they're uncomfortable because they're like, this doesn't feel like it's just being built for COVID. Like, they're telling me this, but you don't have all this background functionality for that. And sometimes those things are over explained in the parts that are not really relevant and under explained in the parts that are most important, particularly to decision makers and government officials who may not have expertise, but just have knowledge in the field, like being a physician or being a health administrator. But meanwhile, you're engaging with people who do supercomputing and who also hold office at Google, at Amazon, and are at the same table, as is the case here in Ontario. So how do folks who are maybe right at the computer being asked to do some of this stuff, how do they think through this moment? And then we have a question coming at us.
Yeah, so I don't really identify any one kind of single point when my opinion changed. I think that if you're in an organization, especially if it's a major company, their fingers are in so many pies, and if they're doing one highly questionable thing, they're probably doing about 100 of them. And it's more of a question of which one of those issues might have resonated most with you. And oftentimes it's investigative journalism that really brings these things to light, even if you're an employee within the company. And I'll say, even as an academic, I was sort of come from the Department of Energy community, where the question of, do you want to develop nuclear weapons is the central question. Kind of like nuclear weapons and the oil industry are where the money comes from in a lot of applied math. And I didn't particularly want to do either of those two things, and that's why I went to the tech industry. And it's sort of unfortunate to find that there's very different kinds of concerns you might have. Like, is your company perhaps touching the data of people under 13 and using that to build machine learning models? Is your company setting up modifications of its products that help an authoritarian government suppress human rights activists in exchange for you having market access? Which, by the way, is not an issue solely limited to any one government. I know China is the nation people are thinking of when I say this, but Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, et cetera. So for me personally, the question of, as someone who is spending a lot of time volunteering with labor organizations, with really caring about dissent, feeling like I was, well, not feeling like, directly profiting through my stock options from a company willfully not only building modifications to suppress human rights activity, but defending it, that was just too far. And I just wasn't okay with that.
So it sounds like ultimately people have to kind of identify where their ethics stand before, and kind of see when that watermark gets hit. I'm just going to read something here. It said, what culpabilities exist for researchers and MDs who market collection, I'm assuming, of data for social needs and sociodemographic info in EMRs as necessary and protective for vulnerable populations? Okay, that's a lot. I think in the context we're talking about, why don't you go in there, Jack?
Yeah, so I'm not a healthcare professional, and so I'm not going to pretend to be one on TV. So what I do feel comfortable talking about is, just as a tech worker, the way that my fellow also non-medical experts were being kind of drafted into working on medical issues. And I think I kind of laid that out. And one of the major themes there, or one of the questions, is the degree to which, one, it's transparent, and just that a patient even has the right to know that their data is being transferred to some of these companies. And so, like, oftentimes when artificial intelligence is deployed, there's an assumption that, well, if you're going to do that right, it really needs to be done on the cloud of a major tech company so that you can use their APIs, whether that's Amazon's AI for machine learning, or the way Google Cloud is advocating for similar things. And so what I would point to is maybe slightly tangenting from the question, there was a whistleblower at Google that pointed out that more than 50 million Americans had their healthcare records without their knowledge, including their names, transferred to Google as part of a partnership they had with Ascension, which is one of the largest private healthcare nonprofits in the US. And so the reason this person blew the whistle on it is to them, it was just a core question of transparency. And so I think consent is maybe at the heart of that as well. Like, how do you consent to something if you don't even know it's happening? And oftentimes when you go into these more AI, machine learning related things, they become very corporate, and with a corporate partnership, there tends to come a lot of secrecy. And so, again, not as a healthcare professional, I think there have already been cases of whistleblowers concerned that the tech companies are not transparent about who has access to the healthcare records.
And I think that's an important thing, because one of the, for those of us who have worked in the healthcare context, either in managing facilities, large projects, or as clinical providers, one of the things we know that we get drilled into is, especially if we're in a large facility, because usually of the size and the scale, is that you can't look at a health record of another patient unless you're explicitly directed to do so, and that you're not allowed to move across a patient's health record unless there's an explicit reason to do so. So it's a need-to-know basis. Mm-hmm. However, with the advent of how machine learning and AI is being integrated, that rule is being broken down from the inside out. So while clinicians and everyday people are making sure that they avert their eyes from the fields on the screen that are not their business, we have a worm, in essence, kind of mixing it all up in the background in a way that we in the foreground have been trained not to do. But it poses some problems, because when it comes to consent, how do we as Canadians put that line in the sand? So I'm going to read this comment here. It says, a regulatory framework of transparency and interpretability is required going forward for private-public partnerships and global governance in a timely manner. I think that that's the statement of the day, because ultimately what we're talking about here is there's a lack of regulatory and legal framework. Next comment, what would transparency look like? Ideally, what kind of transparency would you want to see in the best case scenario? So let's kick that question around a little bit, because one of the reasons we segued into here is because the title for today is Healthcare Data and Informed Consent in the 21st Century. And when we talk about EMR and EHRs, there are proponents, and I know that healthcare is not your area, but it is mine. You know, there's these proponents for EHR and EMRs containing vast amounts of data. Mm-hmm. And it's almost as if they're living in an alternative reality, as if they don't know that 90% of Canada's EMR and EHR systems are owned by only 4 companies. And that's before we get the report of what happened when Google comes to market and Amazon comes to market. So it'll probably drop to 2. And then they'll probably just divvy up the business, and it might be 1.5. So do you want, as a nation state and as an individual, the equivalent of Ma Bell, holding not only every credit card, every search you've ever done, every movie you've ever watched, but do you also want them having your healthcare data? And to some people, you might say, it doesn't matter. But back to this question of transparency and what would we ideally like to see. And I think for folks that this is not their bailiwick, why would we want to see that transparency? So what kind of transparency would you be interested in, Jack? And then I'll take a stab at it too.
So I'm an advisor for a nonprofit like human rights legal group called Foxglove that recently had successful freedom of information requests for contracts between some of the companies I mentioned, Palantir, Faculty, Amazon, Google, Microsoft with the UK's National Health Service. And so one of the obvious things to ask for is that those contracts be proactively made public rather than even requiring such a lengthy freedom of information request process. I think more transparency in contracting is really important. To some degree, many journalists are arguing that even if you're successful with freedom of information requests, for example, in the case of military contracts, but more broadly, more and more is redacted under the auspices of it being proprietary, confidential information. And so obviously, as there is further privatization, there are more pieces of the public infrastructure that are going to be hidden behind these confidentiality redactions. And so I think that pushing back against that rollback of transparency is really important. And ideally, we could actually move forward as opposed to backwards. And you could ask for something like a public consultation before the contracts. Like, why is it that the public only finds out what happened later with nonprofits, having to fight, as opposed to having had a say from the beginning, which, looks a little bit more like something like what happened with Sidewalk Labs, where there was a public consultation. And so I think something a bit closer to that makes sense once it's, healthcare records going into companies which many may be extremely uncomfortable with.
I want to say thank you for that. In terms of transparency, I would definitely agree with you around having that information available upfront about who, in terms of procurement. But I also think while a project's going on. So for instance, in the province of Ontario, we have a health data platform, and we have yet to see a list of names, affiliations, of who's at that table. And because of my research and my work, I'm very curious about how many of those people have just a singular role as public employees, and how many of those people either currently hold an office with any of the big six or their friends, the smaller suppliers, and also are at the table unnamed as private entities. A lot of this public-private partnership language is being used to maybe innocently conceal the relationship between privatization and austerity. So in Ontario, we're being told constantly that we need to decrease the health budget and therefore delist services and ration even more in order to, quote, improve wait times or improve response for COVID. However, at the same time, they invest money in areas of the budget that have nothing to do with maintaining a civil society. And so when I think about that transparency, and what you've said and what your report kind of points out to me, it's that we need a very clear list of who's at the table. And before they even get to the table, like, who put it all together? Like, whose house are we at? Like, whose table is that? Whose tablecloth? Whose china are we using?
Right.
Because so often we end up finding that we're in bed with companies that have gross human rights violations and are in court, morning to night. So do we want as Canadians to be investing in companies that are in court with other nations for violating their laws and in bed with the military and wearing double hats? That sounds like a little too many things mixed up. So I like this idea of people laying out beforehand, here is the contract. Most importantly, I think the government has to explain why we even need it, to make it transparent, and then have people bid on it so it's a public process. Because as we saw with Sidewalk Labs, Ontarians weren't going to have it. If governments created laws to block companies from combining data sets, would they be enforceable? I think that depends on whether we make it a priority. I mean, in the city of Toronto, we're spending $1 billion on individuals that may or may not have a certain amount of value, depending on whether life and people having full lives is important. So we have $1 billion being spent while we have a shortfall in transit and we have a shortfall in essential services, but we're prioritizing policing. And I think that if we think that Ontarians are important, we will provide the resources. I'm wondering what your thoughts are, just, thinking again about your report and about the way relationships overlap and turn back on each other and influence different things. What are your thoughts about enforceability?
So I think a lawyer would ideally be not just consulted on this question, but also paired with people that have a bit of machine learning experience to answer this question properly. And the reason I say that is that I think to a large degree, this comes down to a definition of terms. What do you mean by combining data sets? Is something I think a lawyer would need to be involved with. I will say that as someone who knows people working at for-profit companies in Canada, I have a friend who kind of jokingly explained to me how it was that through some clever usage of some modern machine learning techniques, even though in the finance sector, there's technically rules saying you can't have two data sets interact, if you build a machine learning model in just such a way that technically it doesn't count as the two data sets interacting. And so there's a question of, I think, getting at what does it actually mean when you define the term, combine? Does it mean that you can't, that anything that ever sees one of the data sets can never have a downstream interaction with one of the other data sets? These are things that, I think it would be best to sort of consult someone who solely studies this topic, because I think it's extraordinarily technical and but also important.
I wanted to kind of go with that, in the idea that right now we have these very flat asks that aren't very dynamic, right? So who needs to be present in terms of human rights? Who needs to be present in terms of the population? Who needs to be present in terms of the value and importance of building and maintaining civil society and not just profit at all costs? Who needs to be around, and how do their decisions need to be weighted in order to factor in a meaningful way? I think what we're actually talking about is how are we going to be architects of this new data-based world that is encroaching more and more on what used to be more openly negotiated processes. One of the things that I found quite interesting in reading your work and following the links that it linked to was how many spaces these companies take up in how many different ways, and how they change by mergers and acquisitions and holding names, and so that we could literally have these companies in our midst, as we do, as you said, they're part of everything, and not be really thinking about who else needs to be there, because their goal is profit. Ontarians' goal is a society that functions, that doesn't leave people behind, that furthers and advances democracy, that looks to work through the treaties and make sure that Indigenous peoples are not only respected, but lead the way. Those are not the questions that the military-industrial complex is interested in. And those aren't particularly the questions of business. And so when I think about data linkages, I think about how is data brought together to advance one agenda and perhaps undernourish another. So how might these data sets be brought together to forward capital and profit, but maybe undernourished or not even provided the opportunity to mingle together that data that helps bring forth a more equitable, free society in which we can all achieve what is possible for us. Like in many ways, when you have a lot of the folks that are there for profit, I mean, it seems like it gets pulled, right? I didn't notice a lot of room for a lot of diversity in the companies that I followed. As I clicked on the links in the report and went through, they kind of seemed to be like a repeat of themselves, even aesthetically. As I tried to find the pictures of who ran them, I was like, wow.
Yeah, so there is a degree, though, which there's kind of the opposite story, which is if you look at one of the Defense Innovation Initiative organizations called the Defense Innovation Unit, which I'm using a bit of jargon, but essentially there's a giant effort roughly started around 2014 in the US, which said the US military, to deter, say, China and Russia, must incorporate AI and machine learning into its battle networks because it has fewer troops. And so a number of organizations were set up to lead that effort. One of them was the Defense Innovation Board, which happens to be chaired by the former CEO of Google. Another was the National Security Commission on AI, which happens to be chaired by the former CEO of Google. And another was the Defense Innovation Unit. And think of that as roughly like a venture capital arm of this effort. And it actually primarily works with a bunch of very small companies. And the appendix of the report, I mapped out quite a few of those companies that it's worked with. And so that's been responsible for like setting up a software company within the Department of Defense, in particular within the Air Force. But that kind of touches on one of the last question that a listener asked, which was, how do we push for more accountability from these major companies? And the way I think of that question more and more is that there just will never be accountability if we just keep allowing the billionaires running these companies to effectively, not just effectively, to literally assume senior policy roles and to be the people in charge of how their own industry is regulated. So like I said, the CEO of Google is chairing the former CEO of Google is chairing 2 of these defense boards. And it was actually even made public in the New York Times a few weeks ago that it's being recommended that Eric Schmidt and Reid Hoffman, who was the CEO of LinkedIn, be 2 of the senior tech advisors to a potential Biden administration. And so it's only looking like the sort of political influence, which I haven't even touched official lobbying, is being used to determine policy. And you can't have accountability if the very people running these companies determine what accountability even means.
I wanted to try to weave in these 2 pieces that came up on the screen with something you said around the political nature of this animal and the lobbying. So this last quote here asks about, are there any silver bullets, or do these tend to require sophisticated regulatory frameworks? And is there a role model? So let's just start with the last one, then go back to the other question from earlier.
Yeah, is there a role model? That's a harder question. I tend to avoid those kinds of questions because oftentimes you just may not know what that person or organization was doing, and so it's a bit difficult to tie yourself to them. I would generally say there are no silver bullets. One of the things that's been most important, for example, I cited some whistleblowers. That's the only way we knew about the Google deal with Ascension. Whistleblowers are very important. Labor organizing is very important. Investigative journalism is very important. Legislation is also important. Getting CEOs out of regulatory leaning institutions is very important. There's another issue which we haven't addressed either, which is, and that Lana, you hinted at earlier, which is oftentimes some of these civil servants move to and from the very institutions they might be in charge of contracting with. This is definitely the case with defense, and famously the whole notion of revolving door is used to describe this. What I think is worth pointing out is that that's actually accelerating, and I would say it's actually gotten to the point where the very notion that those conflicts of interest are even bad is being challenged. And the argument is that it's actually necessary to have employees circulate simply for capacity reasons. And so if you talk in the case of defense, if you set up an existential crisis of, say, China defeating us militarily via an AI advantage, then it's pretty easy to argue that whatever is needed to advance the US the fastest you must do. Perhaps one can have some sort of an analog of that for healthcare, which would be to say, well, if we really care about, curing cancer, whatever, that we really need to be as productive as possible. And maybe we should lower our standards a bit with conflicts of interest between public and private sector in order to get there. So I would, if I had to bet, I'd assume that's going to happen roughly the same as it's very publicly happening with defense.
I think you're not only right, I think we can see examples of that, right? We've been told often there's a dichotomy, and COVID conversations is not just about the theorized, because much of what we talk about is in the real world. Is the real world notion that constantly we're seeing this language creep in that there's a war on COVID when it's actually a virus. We've heard language invoked about we're saving lives, but yet we didn't actually put labor laws in place and hold our government and owners of long-term care facilities to the fire when literally we had massive deaths in long-term care facilities and the workers that work there being harmed and dying. So where we could actually do something and save lives, those people stood on the sideline and wrote articles. And where we've needed people to get out in the streets and to use their power as doctors and administrators and universities, which is to intervene in the legislature, They haven't, but yet they're the same people who are saying, give up your privacy rights, give up the Constitution, give up Ontario Human Rights Code, because, we're just going to do this, as Doug Ford just made himself 2 years with no oversight. Like, the last I checked, when I went to school in this fair place, we had a constitutional democracy, which means that you voted, there were limited terms, that there's oversight, there's checks and balances. We just saw Doug Ford literally remove oversight, checks and balances, claiming that he needs it for COVID. And there's no relationship between what he needs to do, because what he needed to do is not pass the laws that people ask that will harm long-term care facilities and the staff in them. So this politicking, this revolving door, and I'm going to touch in a minute on the Personal Health Information Act. There have been over 4 changes made in less than the last 60 days to that act, separately, independently, that basically deconstructs any protections our personal health information should have. And so there was a question earlier on the REB, and I just want to kind of flip back to that before we take the next question, which is REBs only affect research in the ivory tower, so that's in the academy. And so when it comes to people that are in the academy doing innovation through any of the Tri-Council funded grants in Canada, i.e. NSERC or CAHR, to a lesser degree SSHRC, the Research Ethics Board is there as the protection for the scientist to make sure that they stay in the legal bounds, to protect the hospital or the community center's institutional integrity at a legal level. That has little or nothing to do with the actual people. So a research ethics board is a legal intervention to protect the researcher and the corporation that they work for. It is a misnomer to think that that institution has any express responsibility to the individual, other than to make sure that the researcher and the institution stay out of court, and if they do end up in court, that they win. So REBs are in essence the Rottweiler that protects the institution and the researcher. They're not designed for you and I, who are the subjects of research. That's the imbalance that we have, and that's something that we look for.
Yeah, there's a really incredible paper that I learned about because I was wrong on the subject, and one of the authors explained to me, you should read my paper, which is from Jacob Metcalf and Kate Crawford, which is essentially entirely focused on the question of why, well, it's a statement that IRBs or institutional review boards are not sufficient for the world of AI and machine learning. And as far as I understood the paper, they essentially made 2 core kind of arguments. One, it's sort of a term of art, and at least in the US, it entirely applies to information funded by the government. It does not apply to any work done in the private sector. So that already knocks out essentially everything. But then the other component is that the sort of core ethics are almost entirely focused on what harm might come to the participants in the study, not what harm might come from the generalization implied by the machine learning model. And that's sort of the entire point of training any of these systems, is that you can extrapolate beyond the data points that actually built the model and use it to infer in other situations. And so, one example would be a paper on building facial recognition to say identify Uyghur Muslims. If you get consent from the individuals that you use to train the model, does that make it ethical if it's then going to be implied to the rest of the population? Because the actual people the thing will be used on weren't actually technically part of the study itself. And so those are kind of the issues. And there are people academics who have studied that issue very deeply. But I would just sort of flag, as someone that's fallen for advocating for more IRBs in things like when you tweak a website, should that be considered human subject research? People who are more expert in this than me say, actually don't use the IRB language. It's not, you're sort of falling for the trap that it won't do what you think it will do. You at least give it a new name and sort of explicitly carve out these pitfalls. So that would be kind of I would start by recommending any reader to find that paper if they're interested in this.
and we'll try to pull it up. I also just want to bring back the language. IRB is Internal Review Board, and an REB is a Research Ethics Board. These names are used in one in the US and the latter in Canada, and these are the instruments that are used by particularly hospitals, universities, or any institution that is using public funds. And Jack, this is the same here in Canada, as you know, public funds to do research from particularly the Tri-Council organizations, which is SSHRC, which is where you do social science research, CHR is where health research is done, and NSERC is where engineering, computational science, and natural resources research is done. And so the RIB is very limited, and it has no intentions of addressing the kinds of questions that our attendees and listeners are asking for. And so as we come to the last 4 minutes, I wanted to jump back to kind of just pulling this together. So we started the conversation talking about providing a window into what tech companies are doing and what their workings. And so one of the things we highlighted was reports of Silicon Valley military divide have been greatly exaggerated. That's the report that Jack has available on his website that came out on July 7th. It's very interesting. I encourage you to take a look at it. And what's important is that as Canadians, we spend a lot of time imagining that we're so different. And I just want to point out to you that almost every piece of AI and ML that comes across, it may have had a Canadian in the mix, but that Canadian was probably working for an American company. And the reality is that what goes on south of the border, there is no border in AI and ML. It is fluid. It sees no borders in terms of how it functions and what it can do and what's being sold to us. And so pay attention, folks. Salesforce now is handling your public health data. That agency has a number of human rights infractions that are concerns and going concerns. You can look it up. They're also involved in Department of Defense. Is that a problem? I don't know. I think I want to know what else Salesforce is doing before I pay tax dollars to a company that none of us had any say in. Because what we do know about Ontarians, what we do know about Canadians is we do value our togetherness. We do value the opportunity to create something new and not just keep doing the same old thing that generates racism and sexism and exclusion. How would you recommend, I'm just going to read this thing on the screen. How would you recommend that somebody finds out where their health data is being used, how to empower people to have ownership of their own data? I think we have two things here. One, if you're talking about a private corporation, that's PIPEDA. That's the Privacy and Information Act at the federal level, and that's specifically for corporations. We can put some information up there as at the close. And so you can literally ask for that information. Will it be meaningful because of the way our regulation is written? Probably not. They're probably going to give you a gobbledygook page where you're just like, I don't know what this means. And that's a problem. That's one of the reasons why I have deep concerns about our federal protection systems for data. Because even if you ask for that, you wouldn't be able to discern, are you okay? Are you not okay? And there's actually no one to walk you through that. Number two, the other part of the question is like, what else can we do to empower? Here at Ready for Black Lives, we have a protocol. It specifically addresses the issues for Black populations because we're subject to algorithmic racism and AI apartheid, but this affects everyone, right? Like there's nobody that benefits from a system that is sick and that secludes and excludes peoples and harms them. But what we do more broadly is we have these conversations to make you get up and look, write a letter to your MP, find out what your city's doing. Like, what is the city of Toronto doing? Because we know right now that provincially we've moved healthcare data into police cars. And that's a fundamental issue. And we want to ask, I'm going to make a shout out here to all of our lawyers. Where are you at? We're going to be calling you. We're going to be asking you to come out. And as we close in this last minute, I want to encourage you to take a look at Bill 188. You're going to be hearing some information coming to you. I want to say thank you to you, Jack Polson, for coming and kind of opening the window to kind of take the scales off our eyes and stop pretending that we're in Kansas and get into reality.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for all of you folks, we're going to build on this block. So this is the first block. Tomorrow we bring the next block with Kathy O'Neill. So we're layering this. So by Friday, we'll have a very complex understanding of what's going on underneath, which is what you asked for from COVID Conversations at the symposium piece. We're going to leave you now, and I hope to see you tomorrow from 2:30 to 3:30. We hope to have you back, Jack, so that we can kind of look at some more of these connections as they evolve. And I know you're going to continue your work, and I will continue to bring it to our audience. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Lana.
Wonderful. See you all soon.
Take care.